All right, so we'll go ahead and get started here. So welcome to our introduction to Anvil session. We're going to be mostly covering what Anvil is and how to get started on Anvil rather than the nitty-gritty of the actual details of the individual applications you can use on Anvil. And as I mentioned earlier, it's going to be mostly a overview of Anvil itself and how to get started. And because of the amount of setup it requires, even with demo accounts, to get Anvil out to y'all so you can do hands-on stuff with it, it's gonna kind of mostly be show and tell. But again, feel free to ask questions. We will be recording this session as well, but again, we will be taking out anyone else who's not HCC staff talking, as well as any names, just to help protect your privacy. Let me actually get my chat box on the screen as well. So to kind of introduce Anvil, it's our OpenStack cloud resource that offers very customizable virtual machines. In other words, it's basically virtual computers, like a virtual desktop almost, to where if you have a project or an application that doesn't run on, say, Crane or Swan very well, or I mean, not say very well, but at all. So it's things like software with the GUIs, something that needs Windows, or something where you need root or dedicated access, such as wanting to set up your own test cluster, a web server for development, or one of our common cases is a persistent database, so like MySQL or Postgres. Anvil is great for those applications, but if you're needing to do large amounts of compute, working on getting your workflow over to Crane and Swan is going to be the more ideal position for those. And so to kind of talk about more what a virtual machine is it's basically a computer within a computer where, similar to how your jobs on Crane and Swan are sharing a whole bunch of hardware all at once, a virtual machine is essentially a very long-running persistent job, as one way to think of it, and they can contain different operating systems. And on Anvil, we offer up Windows 10, Ubuntu, CentOS, Alma Linux, as well as a few pre-built images of different operating systems with applications installed. And this is kind of just a more technical view of what a virtual machine is, where you can have, say, your physical desktop or laptop as this outermost layer of the diagram. That's your actual hardware itself. Then on top of that, or inside of that, there is a virtualization layer, such as, in our case, OpenStack, which handles the provisioning of resources and the containerization of the virtual machines. And then those virtual machines or computers are just like a computer you'd buy off the shelf, and you can provision them the same way. You can interact with them in the same way. That's a little different since these live in a cloud environment itself. And so some terminology that we're going to be using throughout today is going to be a project, which is essentially just a translation of your HCC group, but into something Anvil can understand. Excuse me. There's also going to be images, which is the software, including the operating system, to run your virtual machine. So think of it as Windows, Mac OS, or Linux, and then any additional applications installed onto those operating systems. So it's kind of like sharing a flash drive with everything together. Our flavors is essentially the hardware within that virtual machine itself. So it's like how you can go out to, say, Best Buy or some other store and buy different spec or laptops or desktops. That's essentially what a flavor is. And you can take that image and that flavor to combine them together into an instance, which is the virtual machine itself. In case you need extra storage or storage that can be moved around to different instances, you can add a volume, which is essentially an external hard drive to the instance itself. And then if you ever need to take a backup of that volume or that instance, you can take a snapshot of it, which is just a copy of the volume for either the instance or the external volume itself at that moment in time. So really great if you have a database and you want to have a backup of it, just in case you need to do a change and something goes horribly awry. That's a great thing to use snapshots for. And so setting up a instance on Anvil is very similar to buying a new computer. before you can set it up or before you can start using it, you need to set up the machine, set up your login information, so your username and password, add your files, and then you need to make sure your computer is turned on, log into it, and then you can actually begin working. And with Anvil, it's very similar steps, though we have to translate it to where rather than setting up the machine, you're creating the instance itself. Your login is using what's known as SSH keys themselves. So we'll talk about that very briefly, and we'll do a quick little demo of it. You'll still need to add your files and software. And then rather than checking if a physical computer is on, you just need to make sure your instance is running through the web dashboard, which we'll do a quick little walkthrough of. Then you can connect to your instance and begin actually working, which is great. So we're not going to go too much into this, but essentially to create a virtual machine, the first step is going to be logging into the Anvil VPN and the web portal, creating your SSH keys, and then creating and connecting to the instance. And so the web portal itself, which is where everything is managed from, is accessible from the internet overall. So you can access it from Florida without any issues, while the Anvil instances themselves are only accessible from behind the Anvil VPN itself, or from our resources like Crane and Swan. And this is mostly as a security concern, as we aren't managing these instances. And so we want to make sure that they are as secure as possible when we can't manage them. Okay. And then for clients, in terms of VPN clients, we use the Cisco AnyConnect client as our primary one. But if you want to use something a little more open source, you can use the OpenConnect client and it'll work perfectly fine as well. Once you've had these clients installed, you can connect to the Anvil VPN itself, which is just anvil-vpn.unl.edu. You'll sign in with your HCC username and password, and then just go through Duo like normal. Now I just clicked on the wrong thing. So we talked about SSH keys very, very briefly. And essentially, these are kind of like your house lock in terms of trust, where when you create a set of SSH keys, you create a public key and a private key, where the public key is something you can give out to everyone, and it's a way that can be authenticated against the private key. So you can share your public key openly with everyone. It's very similar to, say, the lock on your office door, your car door, your house or apartment. However, the only way to open up your doors or that lock is with the private key itself, which only you have, ideally. And as a result, you should be treating your private key very similarly to a password, where if someone managed to make a copy of your physical brass key for your doors, they would be able to get in, and there would be no way to tell if it's actually you or not. That's kind of one of the biggest caveats. But by using SSH keys, we're able to do a lot of the automation that we do for setting up instances on Anvil. And this is kind of just a quick little overview, where an Anvil instance is very similar to your apartment or house. You trust your physical door to only allow people with the private key or your brass key in. And so by locking it with that public key, only you with your private key can get into your apartment, or in this case, the Anvil instance itself. Any questions so far before we dig into kind of doing demos? And feel free to mic up or type in chat. Okay, I don't see anything. Okay, and my screen just froze. There we go. So to log into the Anvil VPN, or not the Anvil VPN, the Anvil web portal, it's just as simple as going to anvil.unl.edu. And if I could spell Anvil correctly. To get access to this, you have to request access to Anvil, as it's not a immediately open resource to every group or every user. And this is just through a simple web form available on our website. But once you have access to it, you can sign into it with your HCC credentials. So let me go ahead and sign in here with my HCC username and my password. You'll get a little duo notification on your phone, or you can use a YubiKey as it instructs at the bottom. And approve. And so this is kind of just a quick general summary of what your HCC group or your project is doing on Anvil. In the top part of the screen, we can see our limits summary, which is just showing the limits our group has on Anvil, to where we can only have 64 instances in my demo group, which shares 64 cores, 256 gigabytes of memory, has 100 gigabytes of external storage, but can have 32 essentially external hard drives, but they share that 100 gigabytes. We can see I have 2 instances already created and potentially running. On the left-hand side, we can access different areas of the Anvil interface. Right now, we're currently in the overview. We want to actually go look at our computers, our virtual machines. We can go to this Instances tab on the left-hand side, where we can see that basically the instance name, what image was used to create it. So these are going back to those different flavors of software that we talked about. We can see the address of which to connect to the Anvil instance, as well as our flavor, so what the hardware spec for that virtual machine is, the SSH key pair used to generate it, the current status. And so right now we couldn't connect to these virtual machines because they're turned off. We can also see that they've been shut down, and they're about almost 2 years old now, probably created at Kickstart back in 2020. From here, you can also manage your different instances as well. So if we want to go ahead and start our demo Fedora instance, it's just as simple as clicking the Start Instance button. It will spin up here. And from here, we can do different things like editing the different hardware, viewing the console as it boots up, retrieving the password if it's a Windows instance, since Windows can't use SSH keys directly. But this is a great way to kind of troubleshoot, as well as if for some reason it's not loading immediately, you can see what's going on. If we go back to the left-hand side, you can go to volumes. And these are basically just your list of volumes that you have. We don't have any on our demo group, so we can't really show that off. Then we don't have any images specific to, or I guess we do have some images specific to our group, but we can see our different snapshots or our different DVOS disks, to where if we want to use these to make an instance, we could. And then the big thing is going to be the access and security, which is where you manage basically your firewall for the virtual machines, as well as your key pairs. So if we go back to our slides here and kind of just shimmy on through, okay, we don't talk about resources yet. So what we'll go ahead and do now is we will go ahead and create our key pairs. So if you have been able to use the terminal for the previous sessions with Swan, to where you can SSH into Swan, you can follow along through the terminal to create your pairs. You don't need to follow along since we won't be able to add all the key pairs in. But is this a good size for everyone? Give me a green check if it's a good size on my terminal, a red X if it's not. Okay, I see a green check. All right, so what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to use a command called Ssh Keygen. And essentially, as the name implies, it creates SSH keys. So I'll do SSH-keygen. Then Anvil uses RSA keys. So we're going to specify type with -t and RSA. We're going to give it basically just amount of entropy. And so we're just going to do 4096 bytes. Then we'll call it my Anvil key pair. And this is essentially the local file instance that you have, or the local copy of your key that you have. So we'll go ahead and generate that. From there, we will go ahead and add a password to protect our key. So I'm going to go ahead and do that here. And we can see that we now have an SSH key generated. We have a nice little figure to show that's been generated as well. If I type ls, we can see we have my Anvil key pair and my Anvil key pair.pub. And so the first one is the private key, that one we want to keep safe. It's the lock to our door. And then that .pub file means it's the public key, which is the lock that we expose to the rest of the world and that we use our keys to open. So what we will go ahead and do is, because I can safely share the public key, I'm going to go ahead and just do cat myanvilkey.pub. And so this is my public key. This is entirely safe to share with everyone else, as it's essentially, again, it's equivalent to the lock on your door. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this and go back to our Anvil page here. And to add in your SSH key for your user, and again, this is how you authenticate with an Anvil, is you go to import key pair. We'll call it, we'll just call it Kickstart 2022 key pair. We'll go ahead and paste our key in there, and we'll select import. So now we can see that we have our fingerprint that was mentioned earlier, and we can use this key to authenticate with all of our other instances. So we'll go ahead and actually start creating an instance, and this will be a good time to chat as well. But to launch an instance, it's as simple as going back to your instances page and going to the launch instance button. This is kind of where you start customizing your computer or your virtual machine quite a bit. And so we can go ahead and call it, let's say, my new Linux VM. We'll go ahead and choose our flavors, and we'll talk a little bit more about these flavors towards the end. But we'll just go ahead and call it a general medium. Then, because we want to use a predefined image, we're going to go to our boot source, select the source, boot from image. Then we're going to select an image, and these are all the available ones that we have, both publicly at HCC, which is actually the majority of these, but also the ones that we have in our demo group. So if you're doing a project with your group and you want to have an instance that you can share with everyone else, that's one way to do it. So we'll go ahead and actually just do CentOS 7.4. So now we have our hardware. Now we need to essentially create our username and login for the virtual machine itself. And we'll go to Access and Security. We'll select our key pair, and then we need to give it the default security group or the default firewall. We need to connect it to the internet as well. So go to networking and just drag and drop the cluster interface and click on launch. And this will take a few minutes to spin up as well. It's basically just like booting a computer or a phone for the first time. And we'll go ahead and do this again with a Windows instance, as just to kind of demonstrate that, where we'll click on launch again. My new Windows computer. Windows can be a little bit heavier, so we'll go ahead and do a very large instance with 8 CPU cores. We'll boot from an image. And let's do Windows 10 with, let's go with Windows 10 and MATLAB. We can go to Access and Security again and select Default with the cluster interface networking and click on Launch. And so right now what's happening in the background is both of these computers are booting up for the first time and getting all the software set up. So if we go to my new Windows computer here, and then go to the console, we can actually see that Windows is starting up. And typically for Linux instances, it takes about maybe 5 or so minutes. Windows, it can take 15 or 20 minutes. So we're going to let these sit on the back burner for a little bit. And that's not the window I wanted. So while we have our computers spin up, we will go ahead and talk about limits and talk about more uses as well. Let's see, where is the slide for that? It looks like we might not have that slide anymore. Whoops. Oh, here we go. Okay. So while our instances spin up, we'll talk about limits. So we saw that limits on the overview dashboard. And essentially what the limits are is it's a very small resource, especially compared to Swan and Crane. Until it's about maybe 30 large computers working together. And so for free, your initial limit is 10 instances or computers, sharing a total of 20 cores, 60 gigabytes of memory, 10 volumes or external drives, and 100 gigabytes of volume storage. These limits can be increased to almost double, basically with a justification email sent to our support email address. If you need more instances or cores or memory, there is a fee. I'm not entirely sure what it is off the top of my head. It's fairly small though. And that can be used to expand your Anvil allocation. Though typically the default values or the slightly increased values is more than enough for most folks. While we wait for those instances to spin up, are there any questions? And feel free to mic up or feel to post it in chat. Okay, so I don't see any questions. So let's go ahead and pull this up. Whoops, it went to the wrong screen. Resume share, there we go. So this is kind of just a quick little, found an old copy of our slides, but these are some of the tasks that a more visual view of what could be done on Anvil, where you can set up your own mini cluster if you want to test some ideas on Anvil. If you're just spinning up a cluster on Anvil to have your own cluster, it's suggested to still use Crane and Swan. The biggest use that I personally see for Anvil is to spin up a dedicated database for your research, especially to access from Crane or Swan, where you need to store some things temporarily or reference some items. Anything where you're doing some research requiring administrative privileges exclusively, or anything that can only run on Windows. Graphical interfaces with the introduction of Open on Demand, which is our next session, has become a lot easier to use, as if it can run on Linux and have a GUI, you can run it through Open on Demand just fine, which is fantastic. But with that in theory, and my windows are jumping around everywhere. So we will go ahead and go back to our instances now, since they should hopefully be about started. It looks like our Windows one is still spinning up, but let's go ahead and check our Linux one. So let's see, where's Linux? There it is. So let's see if it's finished turning on. So if we go to the console again, we can see that it's ready for us to log in. So I'm already connected to the Anvil VPN on my laptop. So this already assumes that you've connected to the VPN. But let me also clear my screen. So we're going to go ahead and log into this VM. So I'm going to split my windows left and right. And to SSH into a Linux VM, the username is going to be kind of just the name of the operating system. And so we'll do SSH, very similar to Swan and Crane. And since this is a CentOS image, our username is CentOS, not your HCC username. At the IP address for the instance, In this case, 10.71.103.194. And then because we don't have a password, we have keys instead to sign into our virtual machine. We will do -I to specify that we want to use a key. And then we're going to specify my Anvil key pair. Push enter. Because this is our first time connecting to this instance, we just need to double check that this is indeed ours and push yes. Enter in the password for your key pair if you're using a password for it. And now we can see that I am CentOS at my new Linux VM. We can do any normal commands that we can, say on Crane and Swan, or not Crane and Swan, but just in general Linux machines. So we can touch a new file, say my new file. We can edit it if we had that installed. Okay, if we have it installed, there we go. This is a text file. And we can cat it. So it's just a standard Linux instance. You also have administrator access as well. So if we want to do, say, sudo, which is the administrator command for Linux, essentially, super user do, we can install our own software on here. And so right now we're acting as an administrator on this Linux instance. I guess because we haven't done some extra steps, it won't let us install it yet. But that's more of just a Linux thing, not an Anvil thing. So we could do sudo yum update. And it'll just do a whole bunch of system updates and package updates for us in the background as root. Let's go see if our Windows instance is done. It's almost there. Oh, it may just have finished. There we go. So it looks like our Windows host might just be about ready. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page so we can see if we can go ahead and start connecting to it. And so Windows, because Windows does not have the ability to use key pairs for authentication, what we have to do instead is decrypt a password. And it looks like the instance is rebooting, which probably means it's not done yet. But to grab the password for your Windows virtual machine, you go back to instances. You select your Windows instance itself. You'll go up to the drop-down menu in the upper right-hand corner, and then click on Retrieve Password. And since this instance isn't fully set up yet, it's going to take some time. The password can't be retrieved yet. So let me go ahead and actually grab this. So while we wait for Windows to finish up, let me go ahead and also post the link for the Anvil documentation into the chat. There we go. So this is kind of where you can get some more tutorials on SAMP, say SQL service on Anvil, how you can do the individual tasks or different methods of connecting. For Linux, it's for the most part, it's going to be the SSH that we've talked about already. For Windows, it's going to be using the remote desktop application on Windows itself, or you can download it on Mac OS. Maybe our virtual machine is ready to connect. So I'll go ahead and go back to retrieve password. It's not ready yet. But yeah, this is kind of why we can't really do too many demos of Anvil hands-on, because it takes a lot of time to spin up these virtual machines. So while we wait on the Windows instance, are there any questions at all? Could be about use cases or questions about Anvil. Could be about the setup or how to potentially use it in your research. Okay, let's see if we can get the password out. Okay, so now that we have the password available to decrypt, what we need to do from here is we can see that we have the encrypted password stored on Anvil, and then we need to give the Anvil basically our private key to unlock it. So I am going to go ahead and upload my private key here. I'm going to go ahead and find it on my desktop. There we go. You do not have permission, of course. Little snafu there.